Hi, my name is Eleanor Winters. At least that's the name my mother gave me. To the rest of the world, to his world, I was never meant to exist. I wasn't supposed to be there. Not in that courtroom. Not with that last name. Not standing upright. From the moment I pushed open those heavy oak doors, their laughter erupted. Not the warm, surprised kind, but the cruel ripple of disbelief. I could see it in their eyes. Why is she here? What does she think she's doing? Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. They sat in the front row, polished and confident. My father's second wife, Vivian, clasping his hand like she owned his legacy. My half-brother Michael leaned back in his chair, smirking with the ease of someone who's always been told he deserves everything. To them, I was the forgotten chapter, the illegitimate daughter, the one hidden from photos and scrubbed from memory. When my name was called, the snickers turned to whispers. I had no legal background, no inheritance, no seat at the table. Just a manila folder with a letter my mother had kept hidden for years, and a heart pounding so hard I could barely hear the judge's voice. My father's will had been contested by the very people who had never once called to check if I was okay. They had closed ranks long ago. I wasn't blood to them, just an inconvenience in heels. I felt the weight of their stares as I walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoing against marble floors that had witnessed generations of justice and injustice. The courthouse smelled of lemon polish and old books, a scent that should have been comforting, but instead tightened the knot in my stomach. 28 years of being invisible. And suddenly I was the spectacle they couldn't ignore. I didn't sleep the night before the hearing. I stayed up rereading that letter 100 times. I never stopped thinking about you. My father had written. What they told you wasn't the truth. The paper had grown thin at the creases, handled too many times, soaked with too many tears. Sometimes I wondered if I was reading between lines that weren't there, finding meaning in words that were merely guilt disguised as love. Growing up, silence was my inheritance. I watched birthday parties from a distance, heard whispers behind doors I wasn't allowed to open. My mother never spoke ill of him, but her sadness clung to the walls like humidity. I was told not to ask questions, so I studied. I worked. I waited. The judge, a woman with silver-rimmed glasses and eyes that had seen too much pretense, looked up from her papers. "Ms. Winters," she said, and the name hung in the air like a challenge. Not Daniels. Not the name that adorned buildings downtown and charity galas in the society pages. Winters, my mother's name. The name of a woman who worked double shifts as a nurse to put food on our table while battling cancer that eventually took her 6 months ago. I'd found the letter in her things, tucked between medical insurance forms and receipts, as if even in death she was trying to protect it, or protect me from it. The date on it was recent, just 3 months before my father's sudden heart attack. A deathbed confession that never made it to an actual deathbed. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to learn, was that I had found someone who believed me. A lawyer who'd handled my mother's estate, a quiet woman with eyes like winter. She saw the letter, the hidden clause, the truth buried under legal jargon and shame. She offered her services without charging a cent. "Some things," she said, "deserve to be set right." I wore the plainest outfit I had. No lipstick, no jewelry. I wanted them to see me, not a version of me they could dismiss. And when the lawyer walked in, carrying the letter as evidence and speaking my full name with clarity and purpose, something in the room shifted. My brother stopped smirking. My father's wife tightened her jaw. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Your Honor," my lawyer began, her voice steady where mine would have trembled. "I'd like to submit this document as evidence of Richard Daniels' intentions regarding his daughter, Eleanor Winters." The word daughter fell like a stone in still water. Ripples of discomfort spread across the faces of the Daniels family. "Objection," their lawyer said immediately, rising from his custom-tailored suit. "This is clearly a forgery or manipulation. Ms. Winters has no standing in this case." "That's exactly what we're here to establish," my lawyer countered. "And I assure you, the handwriting analysis will confirm authenticity." I watched as Vivian leaned over to whisper something to Michael. His face darkened, and he glanced back at me with something new in his eyes. Not quite fear, but the dawning realization that the narrative he'd been fed might have chapters he'd never seen. The courtroom felt like it was closing in on me. The ceiling seemed lower, the walls closer, the air thinner. I focused on my breathing, the way my therapist had taught me during the panic attacks that started after Mom died. In, out, in, out. I am here. I deserve to be here. "Ms. Winters," the judge addressed me directly, "can you tell the court how you came into possession of this letter?" I stood, my knees threatening to buckle beneath me. "It was among my mother's belongings after she passed away in November. She never showed it to me while she was alive." "And you never knew your father acknowledged you?" she asked, her tone neutral, but her eyes piercing. "No, Your Honor. I was told he wanted nothing to do with me." A soft gasp escaped from someone, in the gallery. Perhaps one of the family friends who had come to support the Daniels clan, now witnessing the unraveling of a carefully constructed family myth. My childhood was a series of absences. Empty chairs at school events, blank spaces on forms that asked for a father's name, unopened birthday cards returned to sender. My mother tried to fill those voids with double the love, but some spaces are shaped specifically for the people who leave them. No one else quite fits. I remember being 7 years old, standing outside his office building in the rain. My mother had an appointment nearby, and I'd begged to see where he worked. We stood across the street, me in my yellow raincoat, watching men in suits come and go. "Is that him?" I kept asking. "Is that him?" Eventually, Mom took my hand and led me away. "Not today, sweetheart," she said. But what she meant was, not ever. I grew up creating elaborate fantasies about why he couldn't be with us. He was a secret agent. He had amnesia. He was protecting us from invisible enemies. The truth, that he simply chose not to be, was too painful to accept, so I built worlds where his absence made sense. Children are architects of the narratives that help them survive. In high school, I stopped looking for him in crowds. In college, I stopped mentioning him altogether. I became someone defined by presence rather than absence. Dean's List student, volunteer coordinator, the girl who stayed up all night with friends who needed to talk. If I couldn't have roots, I would be branches, reaching outward rather than down. My mother watched me build this new identity with pride tinged with worry. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," she'd say. But we both knew that wasn't true. In a world that asks for pedigrees and family trees, I was determined to be self-made. I took a summer internship at a publishing house after graduation, proofreading manuscripts for errors others had missed. There was comfort in correcting what was wrong, in making sure stories followed their proper structure. I was good at finding inconsistencies, at spotting the places where narratives broke down. Perhaps I'd had practice. The irony wasn't lost on me. I spent my days fixing fictional worlds while my own remained fractured. But it paid the bills, and eventually led to an editorial position that gave me an identity beyond the girl without a father. I became Eleanor from Meridian Publishing, and there was power in that transformation. My mother never dated after him. "Once was enough," she'd say with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes, on her deathbed, thin and translucent as rice paper. She'd held my hand and whispered, "You were always enough, Ellie. For me, you were everything." I'd kissed her forehead, not knowing about the letter hidden in her desk drawer, not knowing that in a matter of months I'd be standing in a courtroom with his family, claiming a piece of the life that had gone on without me. Now, watching the Daniels family squirm under the judge's scrutiny, I felt no triumph, only a hollow ache where revenge should have been. This wasn't about money or property or shares in the family business. This was about the truth. This was about being acknowledged after a lifetime of erasure. The letter, my lawyer continued, explicitly states that Richard Daniels wished to amend his will to include his firstborn child, Eleanor Winters, as a beneficiary. The date and signature match his known handwriting, as verified by an expert, whose report I've included in our filing. The family's lawyer shuffled through his papers, clearly caught off guard. He'd prepared for a routine dismissal, not a legitimate challenge. I'd seen that look before. The moment when someone realizes they've underestimated you, when they see you're not just a footnote, but a chapter they can't skip over. Furthermore, my lawyer added, there is a clause in Mr. Daniels' original, well, that refers to all of my children, not specifically naming only Michael. This, coupled with the letter expressing his desire to amend the will, creates a clear case for Eleanor's inclusion. Michael snorted, not bothering to hide his contempt. This is ridiculous, he muttered, loud enough for me to hear. Dad would never. Mr. Daniels, the judge cut him off. You'll have your chance to speak when called upon. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. But inside, each word was a paper cut, small, sharp, surprisingly painful. Dad. A word I'd never used, never had the right to use. In Michael's mouth, it sounded like a privilege I wasn't meant to share. The hearing stretched on, legal arguments flowing back and forth like a tide I couldn't control. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might reveal me as the imposter they believed me to be. The manila folder on my lap grew damp from my palms, the letter inside, my only proof, my only connection, suddenly seeming flimsy and insubstantial against the weight of their certainty. Then, as the family's lawyer was mid-sentence, the courtroom, doors opened. A tall, thin man with a familiar profile stepped inside, and the entire Daniels family turned in unison, their faces registering shock that mirrored my own. It was James Harrington, my father's oldest friend and business partner. Your Honor, he said, approaching the bench with purpose. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I have information relevant to this case. The judge nodded, and he was sworn in. James stood at the witness stand, his eyes briefly meeting, mine before addressing the court. I've known Richard Daniels for over 40 years. We built our firm together, vacationed together, watched our children grow up. He paused, correcting himself. Some of our children, that is. The courtroom fell silent. Vivian's knuckles went white around her designer purse. Michael straightened in his chair, no longer leaning back with casual disdain. Mr. Harrington, my lawyer asked, are you familiar with Eleanor Winters? He nodded slowly. I am. I've known about Eleanor since she was born. Richard confided in me from the beginning. And did Mr. Daniels acknowledge Ms. Winters as his daughter to you? Objection! The family's lawyer nearly shouted. Hearsay! Your Honor, my lawyer countered. Mr. Harrington's testimony goes to establishing the deceased's state of mind and intentions, which are directly relevant to interpreting the will and the letter in question. The judge considered for a moment. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Harrington. James cleared his throat, his eyes now fixed somewhere above our heads, as if addressing a memory rather than the people before him. Richard acknowledged Eleanor as his daughter to me many times over the years. He kept a photo of her in his desk drawer. School pictures her mother would send. He never displayed them, but he kept everyone. My heart stuttered in my chest. School pictures? My mother had sent him my school pictures. She'd told me they were just for her records, an extra set in case one got lost. All those years of smiling for the camera, wearing my best dress, hoping this would be the year I looked special enough to matter, and he'd kept them, hidden away like a secret shame. Did Mr. Daniels ever express a desire to include Eleanor in his will, or to acknowledge her publicly? My lawyer pressed. James shifted uncomfortably. Yes, more so in recent years, after his health scare 3 years ago. He talked about making things right, about leaving something for her. But he hesitated, glancing at Vivian, whose face had gone completely rigid. But what, Mr. Harrington? But he was afraid of the fallout, the scandal, the impact on the family name. James looked directly at me then, apology written across his features. He was a coward about it, and I told him so. After your mother got sick, Eleanor, he became more determined. He asked me about ways to amend his will discreetly. A small, bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Even at the end, he'd wanted to help me discreetly, his final act of charity as hidden as his paternity. The irony of it burned in my throat. And did you help him with that process? My lawyer asked. I gave him the name of an estate attorney. I know he met with her at least once. After that, James shrugged. His heart attack happened so suddenly. I don't know if he ever completed the amendment. The family's lawyer jumped in, sensing an opening. So there is no official amendment to the will, merely an unexecuted intention and a letter that could have been written by anyone. The letter is in his handwriting, James said firmly. I'd recognize it anywhere. We signed enough contracts, together over 4 decades. Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like fingernails on glass. This is bullshit, he spat. Uncle James, what are you doing? Dad never said a word about her to us, not once. Sit down, Mr. Daniels, the judge warned. But Michael remained standing, his face flushed with anger. No disrespect, Your Honor, but this woman shows up out of nowhere after Dad dies, waving some letter, and suddenly we're supposed to believe she gets a piece of everything my parents built? Everything that was meant for me? There it was, the entitlement, the assumption that everything was meant for him simply because he had been seen, acknowledged, celebrated. He had grown up in the light while I languished in shadow. And now, he couldn't comprehend why I deserved even a sliver of sunlight. I found my voice then, small but steady. I'm not asking for everything, Michael. I'm not even asking for half. I just want what he intended for me, what he wrote in that letter. You don't even know him, Michael exploded, turning to face me fully. You weren't there when he was sick. You weren't there at his funeral. You're a stranger with our DNA. Nothing more. The words hit like physical blows, and I flinched despite my determination to remain composed. He was right, in a way. I hadn't been there. I hadn't known he was sick. I hadn't been invited to mourn him properly. Mr. Daniels, the judge's voice cracked like a whip. One more outburst and I'll have you removed from my courtroom. Is that clear? Michael sat down heavily, jaw working as if chewing on words he couldn't swallow. The judge turned to James. Mr. Harrington, did Richard Daniels ever talk about why he never acknowledged his daughter publicly or sought contact with her? James looked pained. He said it was complicated, that Eleanor's mother had asked him to stay away, to let them live their lives in peace after things ended badly between them. But I think the real reason was simpler. He was building a life with Vivian, starting fresh. Eleanor was a reminder of his mistakes, his failures. And once enough time had passed, it became harder to bridge that gap. Shame has a way of compounding itself. Shame. Not love, not protection, not respect for my mother's wishes. Shame had kept him from me. Shame had built the wall I spent my life trying to scale. The hearing continued, but I barely heard the legal arguments flying back and forth. I was lost in thought, reconstructing my history with this new information. All those birthdays, all those milestones. He had known about them, all those times I'd wondered if he ever thought of me. He had kept my pictures in a drawer, hidden evidence of my existence. Was that supposed to be a comfort? That he'd remembered me in secret while forgetting me in public? That he'd felt guilt, without ever finding the courage to make amends until death was breathing down his neck? I thought about my mother, who had never spoken ill of him despite everything, who had worked herself to exhaustion rather than pursuing child support through the courts, who had shown me how to stand tall in a world that wanted me to apologize for existing. Had she known he kept those pictures? Had she hoped all along that one day he would reach out? Or had she simply been protecting me from the certainty of his rejection? The judge called for a 15-minute recess. As people shuffled out of the courtroom, I remained seated, afraid that if I moved, the fragile composure I'd maintained might shatter completely. My lawyer touched my shoulder gently. "You're doing fine," she said. "James's testimony helps us enormously." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Across the aisle, Michael and Vivian huddled with their lawyer, voices low but expressions thunderous. James had disappeared, perhaps unwilling to face the family whose perfect image he had just cracked wide open. When the courtroom emptied, I finally allowed myself to breathe deeply, to feel the magnitude of what was happening. For 28 years, I had been a secret kept in a drawer, and now I was written across court documents, spoken aloud by judges and lawyers and witnesses. I existed in ways I never had before, and the reality of it was dizzying. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized, pale, determined, vulnerable in her determination. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it anchoring me to the present. This was happening. This was real. A stall door opened behind me, and Vivian emerged, her expensive perfume filling the small space between us. We locked eyes in the mirror, neither of us moving or speaking for a long moment. "You look like him," she finally said, her voice tight but controlled. "Around the eyes." I hadn't expected that. An acknowledgement, however reluctant. I didn't know how to respond, so I remained silent, watching her through the mirror rather than turning to face her directly. "You need to understand something," she continued, applying fresh lipstick with a steady hand. "Richard wasn't perfect. He made mistakes, you being one of them. But he built something with me, something real and lasting. Michael is his legacy. The company is his legacy. I'm not trying to take that away," I said quietly. "I just want what he meant for me to have." "What he meant for you to have," she repeated, capping her lipstick. "Do you know what my prenuptial agreement with Richard stipulated? That in the event of his death, control of the company would remain with the family, specifically with his legitimate heirs. That was the language we used. The word legitimate stung, a reminder of the social hierarchy that had always kept me separate, less than. "I'm not interested in the company," I told her. "I have my own career, my own life." "But you are interested in the money," she countered, finally turning to face me directly. "I'm interested in the truth," I corrected her, "and in my father's final wishes being honored." Vivian studied me with cool appraisal, as if recalculating the threat I posed. "Your mother could have pursued child support years ago. She chose not to. Why come after his money now?" The question ignited something in me. Not anger exactly, but a fierce protectiveness for my mother's memory. My mother protected me my entire life, from gossip, from rejection, from knowing how little I mattered to him. She worked 2 jobs rather than drag me through a legal battle that would have labeled me exactly what you just called me, a mistake. She had more dignity than that. And yet here you are, in court. "Here I am," I agreed. "Because she's gone. and I found evidence that my father wanted to make amends before he died. I'm here because I deserve to know the truth, and I deserve whatever he intended for me to have. Not because I want it, but because he wanted me to have it. There's a difference. Vivian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. For a fleeting moment, I glimpsed something like respect behind her perfectly applied makeup. Then it was gone, replaced by the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms and charity galas, never revealing her hand. "We'll see what the judge decides," she said, turning to leave. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth, Michael doesn't know everything. Richard made me promise never to tell him about you. He thought it would complicate things." And then she was gone, leaving me alone with my reflection and the echo of her words. Complicate things. As if I were a mathematical error rather than a human being. As if my existence were an inconvenient variable in an otherwise perfect equation. When the hearing resumed, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. News of James's testimony had spread, and the gallery seats had filled with curious onlookers. Distant relatives, business associates, local journalists sensing a story. I felt their eyes on me, assessing, wondering. The forgotten daughter, emerging from obscurity to stake her claim. My lawyer presented the handwriting analysis results, confirming that the letter was indeed written by Richard Daniels. She detailed the specific bequest mentioned in it, not a controlling interest in the business, not a claim on the family home, but a trust fund equal to the one established for Michael at birth, plus an additional sum to account for the education and support I'd never received. Mr. Daniels expressed clear intent to provide for his daughter, she argued. The fact that he died before executing an official amendment to his will does not negate that intent, especially given the corroborating testimony we've heard today. The family's lawyer countered with technical arguments about probate law, about the binding nature of the existing will, about the danger of allowing unexecuted intentions to override legal documents. He was skilled, methodical, and completely devoid of emotion, as if this were merely an intellectual exercise, rather than the validation of a human life. I watched the judge's face for signs of which way she might be leaning, but her expression remained neutral, her questions to both sides equally probing. The hearing stretched into its third hour, and my initial adrenaline had long since faded, leaving me exhausted and raw. During a brief pause while the judge reviewed some documents, I felt a presence beside me. I turned to find James Harrington sliding into the seat next to mine. "I should have done this years ago," he said softly. "I should have pushed him harder. To acknowledge you, I'm sorry, Eleanor." "Why didn't you?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. He sighed heavily. "Loyalty, I suppose. Misplaced loyalty. Richard and I went through everything together. College, starting the firm, marriages, divorces." He shook his head. "When you've known someone that long, you start to accept their flaws, to make excuses for them. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in his family matters. But you kept tabs on me," I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. "Your graduation from Northwestern, your first job at the publishing house, your mother's illness." He looked away, ashamed. "Richard asked me to keep an eye on you both. He sent money for your mother's medical bills anonymously." I felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath me. "What?" "The hospital bills, the home care, the experimental treatments. He paid for all of it. Your mother knew. She didn't want to accept it at first, but the cancer was aggressive, and the treatments were expensive." My mind raced back to those terrible months of my mother's illness. How the doctors had always seemed oddly accommodating despite our modest insurance. How the hospice care had been far better than we could have afforded. I'd assumed it was charity, or payment plans my mother had arranged without telling me to spare me worry. "She never told me," I whispered. She made him promise that you would never know. She didn't want you to feel obligated to a man who had never been there for you. A sob caught in my throat, which I disguised as a cough. My mother, protecting me until the very end, shielding me from the complicated truth that the father who had never claimed me had still, in some small way, tried to care for us when it mattered most. The letter, James continued, was written the day after your mother died. Richard came to me, devastated. He said he'd lost his chance to make things right with her, but he could still do right by you. He drafted it that night. If he felt that strongly, why didn't he just call me, meet with me? Why a letter hidden in legal language? James's smile was sad. Because Richard was a lawyer to his core. He trusted documents more than conversations. And because I think he was afraid of what he'd see in your eyes when you looked at him. Sometimes it's easier to acknowledge your failings on paper than to face them in person. Before I could respond, the court was called back to order. James squeezed my hand once before returning to his seat, leaving me with revelations I had no time to process. When the lawyer took my side, addressing the judge with a passion that made the Daniels family shift uncomfortably in their seats, I watched Michael's face closely. There was anger there, yes, but also confusion, the look of someone whose world was being rewritten without his consent. I recognized that expression. I'd worn it myself many times. Your Honor, my lawyer said, this case is ultimately about a father's final wish to acknowledge his daughter after a lifetime of absence. The letter clearly expresses his intent. The testimony you've heard confirms its authenticity and context. We ask that you honor Richard Daniels' desire to provide for his firstborn child, not as a replacement for the years of support and love she should have received, but as a small measure of justice for a woman who has been denied her rightful place in her father's story. When the lawyer began reading the clause, the final clause, handwritten and initialed by my father weeks before his death, the room fell into a silence so thick it was almost reverent. To my firstborn daughter, who was never acknowledged in public but always held in my heart, I leave a trust equal to that established for my son, with the additional sum of $1 million as inadequate compensation for the years of support she should have received. It is my deepest regret that I lacked the courage to be the father she deserved, and my final hope that this gesture might offer her some small comfort or opportunity in place of all I failed to provide. No one laughed then, not a single sound. The ruling wasn't dramatic, just a few measured words that changed everything: recognition, partial inheritance, and the legal affirmation of what I had always known but never been allowed to say. I mattered. In light of the evidence presented, including the authenticated letter expressing the deceased's clear intent, testimony from Mr. Harrington regarding Mr. Daniels's consistent acknowledgement of his paternal relationship with Ms. Winters, and the language in the existing will referring to all of my children, this court finds that Eleanor Winters is entitled to the bequest described in the letter written by Richard Daniels 3 months prior to his death. I heard the words but couldn't quite believe them. After 28 years of invisibility, I had been seen. After a lifetime of silence, my name had been spoken aloud, recognized, recorded in official documents. The judge continued with technical details about how the trust would be established, about tax implications and disbursement schedules. I nodded as if I were absorbing it all. But in truth, I was watching the faces of the Daniels family. Vivian sat perfectly straight, her expression unreadable. Michael stared at his hands, refusing to look at me or the judge. When it was over, they left quickly. No handshakes, no words, just tight faces and the echo of shoes on marble. I stayed a while, not because I needed to, but because I could. I sat in the empty courtroom and let the quiet stretch around me, full and alive. My lawyer gathered her papers, giving me the space I needed. We won, she said simply, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice done. Thank you, I replied, the words wholly inadequate for what she had given me. Not just legal representation, but validation. Witness. The acknowledgement that my story mattered enough to be fought for. "What will you do now?" she asked. It was a question I hadn't allowed myself to consider. For so long, my focus had been narrow. Find the truth, seek recognition, honor my mother's memory. Now suddenly, I had options I'd never imagined. Financial, security, a new family connection, however reluctant, a different future than the one I'd planned. "I don't know," I admitted. "Keep working, I suppose. Maybe take some time to travel, the way my mother always wanted to but never could. She loved the idea of Italy and the Daniels family." I considered the question carefully. "I'm not looking for a relationship with them. This wasn't about finding a family. I already had one, with my mother. This was about the truth." I paused, thinking of Michael's angry face, of Vivian's reluctant acknowledgement in the bathroom mirror. But I wouldn't close that door entirely. People surprise you sometimes. Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun slanted through yellow leaves, casting dappled shadows across the stone steps. I descended slowly, feeling the weight of the morning's events in every muscle. At the bottom, a figure waited. James Harrington, hands in his pockets, uncertainty in his stance. "I'd like to talk more," he said as I approached. "About your father, about your mother, about you, if you're willing." I studied him, this man who had known the truth all along but had kept my father's secret. I could refuse, walk away, maintain the walls that had kept me safe all these years, or I could choose something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but openness. The possibility of understanding. "Coffee?" I suggested. "There's a place around the corner." He nodded, relief washing over his features. As we walked, I thought about the manila folder in my bag, the letter that had changed everything. I thought about my mother, who had protected me in life and given me the means to claim my truth after her death. I thought about Richard Daniels, who had failed me in every way that mattered, and yet, in his final act, had offered the acknowledgement I'd never thought to receive. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was something. A bridge across the chasm of absence. A foundation upon which I could build whatever came next. The coffee shop was warm and crowded, full of people, going about their ordinary lives, unaware of how mine had just been transformed. James and I found a small table by the window, ordered our drinks, and sat in awkward silence for a moment. "Tell me about my father," I finally said. Not the lawyer, not the businessman, the person. And he did. For the next hour, overcooling, cups of coffee, James told me about Richard Daniels, his love of classical music, his terrible golf swing, his habit of quoting Shakespeare when drunk, his inability to remember birthdays without reminders. He told me about a man who was deeply flawed, sometimes selfish, occasionally brilliant, and perpetually conflicted about the daughter he had never claimed. I listened, not searching for excuses or redemption, but for understanding, for the pieces of my own puzzle that had always been missing. "He kept a file," James said eventually. "News clippings, reports I gave him, those school pictures. After you won the state essay contest in high school, he framed the newspaper mention and kept it in his home office." "Did Vivian know?" "Yes. I think that's why she resents you so much. Not just for existing, but for mattering to him in ways she couldn't control or erase." I thought about the woman in the courtroom, so polished and perfect, so determined to protect what was hers. I thought about what it must have been like to live with the ghost of another woman's child, to know your husband kept secrets that had nothing to do with you. "She's human too," I said softly, surprising myself with the empathy I felt. This can't have been easy for her either. James studied me with new appreciation. "You're very much like your mother that way." She never spoke ill of Richard, even when she had every right to. The comparison warmed something in me. She taught me that bitterness is a poison you drink yourself, hoping someone else will die from it. He laughed, a genuine sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "That sounds exactly like Grace." We talked until the coffee shop began to empty, the afternoon crowd giving way to early evening quiet. James shared stories. I asked questions. And somewhere in that exchange, the outline of Richard Daniels became clearer to me. Not a villain or a hero, but a man who had made choices, some good and many bad, and had lived with their consequences. "I should go," I said eventually, gathering my things. "I have a deadline tomorrow, and my editor isn't going to care that I spent the day in court." "You're still going to work at the publishing house?" James seemed surprised. "Of course. I love my job. The money. It gives me options, security. But I still want to build my own life, my own legacy." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Richard would have respected that. He valued independence. "Even though he never gave me the chance to develop it on my own terms," I pointed out. Not bitterly, just factually. "Yes. Well." James looked down at his empty cup. "None of us are the parents or the people we imagine ourselves to be." We parted ways on the sidewalk outside, exchanging phone numbers with tentative promises to meet again. As I walked to the subway, I felt lighter somehow, as if the weight of unasked questions had finally been lifted from my shoulders. My apartment was dark when I returned, the silence of familiar comfort after the emotional tumult of the day. I moved through the rooms, turning on lamps, putting on water for tea, slipping off the shoes that had pinched my toes through hours of legal proceedings. On my desk sat a framed photo of my mother and me at my college graduation. Both of us, grinning widely into the camera, her arm around my shoulders, mine around her waist. We looked so alike, same eyes, same smile, same determined set to our jaws. But now, with new knowledge, I could see traces of him too. The shape of my forehead, the angle of my cheekbones, the parts of me that came from a man I had never known, but whose DNA I would always carry. I touched the glass gently. "We won, Mom," I whispered. Then I opened my laptop and began to write. Not the manuscript I was supposed to be editing, but something new. My story, our story, the truth in all its complicated, messy glory. 3 months later, on a crisp winter morning, I stood at my mother's grave with a bouquet of her favorite daisies. The cemetery was quiet, just a few other visitors paying their respects at distant plots. "The trust is set up," I told her, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking aloud. "I used some of it to pay off my student loans, like you always wanted me to. The rest is invested. And I've started a scholarship in your name at the nursing school where you studied, for single mothers. I think you'd like that." The wind rustled through the bare branches overhead, sending a shower of snowflakes onto the granite headstone. I brushed them away gently. Michael called last week. It was awkward, but civil. He's getting married in the spring. He invited me to the wedding, if you can believe it. I haven't decided if I'll go. I paused, imagining what she might say. Probably something wise about bridges and healing and the future being more important than the past. I know, I'll think about it. I placed the flowers carefully against the stone, their bright yellow a stark contrast to the winter landscape. James has been helpful. He's introducing me to people at the firm, explaining who I am without apology or secrecy. It's strange to be acknowledged after so long in the shadows. Strange, but good. What I didn't say, what I couldn't quite articulate even to her memory, was how much had changed inside me. The anger I'd carried for years had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something else, a quiet determination to live fully in the light, to claim space in the world without apology. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was truth. It was my name spoken aloud in rooms where it had once been whispered or suppressed. It was the knowledge that I had existed in my father's thoughts, however imperfectly, all along. As I turned to leave, a text message lit up my phone. Vivian, asking if we could meet for lunch next week. An olive branch, perhaps, or at least an acknowledgement that we were now, however reluctantly, connected by law and legacy. I typed a simple response. Yes. Name the place and time. Some names take time to be spoken aloud. Mine took decades. But in the end, it echoed through the room like a verdict long overdue.